Paul is the founder and CEO of the Enlightened Enterprise Academy, and also the reason that we're meeting today and we have this series. Paul's been putting a lot of work behind the scenes on this, I know. But Paul's going to talk to us now and just sort of pick up some of the themes that have been building through the first three sessions on this notion of, if it's not financial maximization we're looking at, we're talking about value and value creation as being one of the lenses in which we can start to see how the needs of other stakeholders can be brought into focus and shaped. So I think Paul will look at now what is the case that value creation is central to solving this dichotomy, and asking the question, who should businesses or organizations be creating value for if it's not shareholder maximization? And do some stakeholders deserve a greater value than others? This is a complicated area and a very important area. So Paul, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. So as Andy's already explained, I wasn't really expecting to be presenting today, but what I am going to present is a paper that I'm working on for London School of Economics at the moment, which is certainly in keeping with the theme of the conference. So I'm going to divide what I've got to say into three parts, as Andy just referred to. So the first part is the purpose of business and the meaning of value in the context of this conference. The second part was going to be the implications for business and their stakeholders. And the third part, I'm going to look at two propositions: the need for a new theory of value and the need for a new enlightenment. So pretty heavy topics, I guess. Let me begin with part one. So part one, the purpose of business and the meaning of value. I think a few questions seem to be central to the issues we're discussing today. So who should business be creating value for? Does any group deserve primacy over others? And how should value be divided up if it's to be shared among different stakeholder groups? So although there's much debate and much discussion, I think one thing isn't in dispute, and that's the idea that the purpose of any business should be creating some form of value. The problem starts when we start to ask, what do we mean by value? So research shows that leaders often don't have a clear idea of what value their business creates, who it's being created for, or how they create it. The research I've quoted frequently is that which was done by McKinsey a number of years ago of board directors who couldn't answer the questions I just mentioned. The bottom line is they don't really have a clear definition of what they mean by value. But then how could they? It's kind of, well, it seems shocking. You may be shocked by the idea that boards and companies don't know what value they're creating, who, for, and how. But you shouldn't be shocked by it, because economists have been struggling with the idea of what value means for the last 300 years. And in 300 years, there have only been really two dominant ideas of what a theory of value is. The model that we use today is the second one, the market price theory of value. It's far from satisfactory, and Oscar Wilde famously summed up the reason why it's not satisfactory, because what it tells us is the price of everything and the value of nothing. We know that, for example, gross domestic product as a measure for the wealth of nations wants to put measures everything in terms of the price, the monetary value of things. And it's a very poor proxy of the measure of prosperity of a nation. The person who designed it never intended it to be used for the purpose it was used for. But we still haven't changed it because we haven't come up with a better theory of value. So in business, we also use monetary value as a proxy of the prosperity of the organization. In this case, profits or share price. And it's also, well, it's not actually a measure of value creation. Profits and share price are a byproduct of value creation. So our poor understanding of what we mean by value is why we struggle to measure what we mean by value properly. And we know that's a problem because we know that what gets measured gets managed, as the saying goes. So we can't measure well, we can't manage well. And that goes for the business, it goes for organizations, and it goes for society too. So the health of business and the health of the economy suffers as a result, I would argue. So let me define what I mean by value. This is in common language, in a sense. So our values, what we judge to be our needs, they're the things that we value. And values realized when our needs are satisfied. So value creation is driven by values. And I think that's a quite simple concept to understand. It sounds like common sense, but it's not very commonly understood. And it's certainly not the way most businesses and organizations actually think about value. Some of our needs are quite basic and don't change over time. Other needs do change over time as we develop and change, and as our situations develop or change. And that's true whether we're talking about us as individuals, us as societies or economies, for example. So much work has already been done in understanding what our needs are. And a lot of work has been done in relating our needs to various stages of development, whether we're talking about individual, organizational, community, or national development. This work's reflected in practice in the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. So meeting the needs for sustainability is a way of creating real value that offers great potential for businesses that are able to design business models to satisfy basic needs for sustainability profitably. C.K. Prahalad explained years ago the fortune that was to be made from the bottom of the pyramid, but many of those needs remain unmet today because of the challenge of working out the kind of business model that allows those needs to be met profitably. But creating value doesn't only mean satisfying basic needs, and sustainability, I would argue, shouldn't be our goal anyway. I think sustainability is just a necessary step in the journey towards achieving our larger goal. So I would define value creation as contributions to sustainable, widely shared prosperity, measured in terms of human flourishing and well-being. And it's not a new idea. Aristotle called it eudaimonia. So I'm going to now move on to the second part of what I wanted to talk about, which is the implications for business and stakeholders of what I've just said. And I'm going to use an illustration to try to make this, well, it's not an illustration, it's a piece of history. I'm going to refer to as history to make this real. So in the 18th century, enlightened thinkers with a very strong set of values decided to harness science and technology to improve the human condition. Most were members of a few religious groups who shared a vision. Their vision was the creation of heaven on earth. And the most famous one of these religious groups was the Quakers. They went on to be the leading pioneers of the first industrial revolution. And these Quaker industrialists, as they are referred to, were also extremely successful capitalists, driven to create value by meeting the real needs of society, the needs of employees, and they created better working conditions than most employers of the time. They paid better than most employers of the time. They provided housing, healthcare, education, all of the things that today we might call shared value. They also provided and met the needs of communities. They produced and built whole villages. Those things we would probably refer to today as investments in social capital. But they built hospitals, schools, and lots of other infrastructure to support communities. They also considered the needs of their suppliers. So they were known as being fair and honest in their dealings, of being happy to pay fair prices. They were also known to be trustworthy, and they wouldn't have anything to do with anybody in their supply chain that was associated in any way with slavery. They also cared about the needs of society. So many of their investments were in infrastructure such as roads, railways, canals, all of the things that they knew were essential to building a strong and healthy economy. Additionally, they campaigned for social reforms and political reforms, and many of their ways of thinking would even today still be regarded as progressive ideas. I think today we would say that they accepted their corporate responsibility. They were good corporate citizens. They created great businesses and great reputations. They created businesses that people wanted to work for, supply, buy from, and many of them remain well-known household names even today, even though in some cases their business model changed and they're not now run by Quakers. A good example being Barclays Bank, for example. When things started to go wrong at Barclays, there was an effort to try to re-establish the culture of Barclays onto something more sustainable by re-examining the roots of the business, which was a Quaker business when it was founded. So I think the Quaker industrialists demonstrate one thing very well. Their enlightened thinking demonstrates that businesses that are managed for the long term, that create value for all stakeholders, also ensure shareholders are extremely well served. They created flourishing businesses, they created flourishing communities, they created a flourishing economy. The Industrial Revolution produced the longest period of increases in prosperity in the history of mankind. So I think the achievement is one that we ought to learn from as we look to what needs to change going forward. In my opinion, I think the example I've just given you is the clearest possible indication that the shareholder v stakeholder debate is based on a false dichotomy. So I'm going to move on to the third part of what I've got to say. I'm going to put forward the two propositions that we need a new theory of value and that a new enlightenment is necessary. I don't think we can afford to stick to the market price theory of value, which tells us the price of everything and the value of nothing. We need a new theory of value. People are probably sick of hearing the phrase paradigm shift. It's an overused phrase, but I think in this case, it's the right phrase to use to describe what I'm proposing. because as I said earlier, in 3 centuries, we've only had 2 theories of value. And both of those 2 theories brought about paradigm shifts at the time. So a third and a new theory of value can be expected to produce another paradigm shift. I've said that value creation is linked to our values. Unfortunately, one of our values is universal and it sits above many other values, and it's the value of dignity. We value it highly because it's closely related to the concept of identity and our very sense of being or being human. It's for these reasons that the right to dignity is the first and the foundational right of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which was ratified by almost every nation on Earth. All other human rights relate to it, and they are really concerned with rights relating to the conditions necessary to be able to live a dignified life. The right to security, shelter, food, water, and so on. So to conclude, I propose that a new enlightenment must see the market price theory of value being replaced by what I'm calling the dignity theory of value. Dignity refers to inherent worth or inherent value. It refers to our own sense of dignity, our own sense of our own inherent worth, but it also relates to our sense of and respect for the inherent worth of others. Importantly, this idea of inherent worth, value, can also be applied to not just other people and societies, but also other beings, whether we're talking about animals, or it can be applied to the inherent worth of nature and the planet. So I think it's an extremely powerful concept and a far better way of thinking about value than using market price as a poor proxy for value. This is addressing what real value is to us as humans. So it's a paradigm shift that I think is going to require a new enlightenment. It's going to require economists and people in lots of different disciplines to get their heads around this concept of a new theory of value. And it's for these reasons that I created the Enlightened Enterprise Academy. The purpose of the Academy is to try to ensure that businesses and organizations in all sectors are creating value in the way I've defined value, contributions to sustainable, widely shared prosperity, measured in terms of human flourishing and well-being. And soon I'll also publish the Enlightened Enterprise Manifesto, which will explain all of this in some more detail. But I'm going to stop there, and I'm not sure how I'm doing in terms of timekeeping. But I imagine there may be some questions if we want to, well, if there's a few minutes left between now and the break. And we can otherwise go for a coffee break early, but let's see how we go.
Thanks very much for that, Paul. That's a very thought-provoking. I think everyone's contemplating the enormity of your vision there, which I think a lot of people resonate with. There were some questions around how this theory might apply to beyond humans, to the sort of nature and the planet writ large. And I think you addressed that at the end, this sense that we live in a system of systems, and there are relationships between those different systems that need to be acknowledged in how we think about value. The world isn't an exhaustible place to strip mine from and create pollution in the pursuit of economic value for the benefit of humans. There is a responsibility that we have more broadly to nurturing the system which sustains us. And I think what you're articulating there does speak to that.
Yeah, it does. I mean, so humans, nature, animals, they're all different types of systems, and so we can talk about the actors involved in each of those systems. But what's important in what you just said is, in systems, it's how the different actors interrelate with each other. And so I think this refers back to understanding the nature of relationships, which was talked about by the other presenters in the other sessions. If we approach our relationships with other people or other beings or the planet from the perspective of respect for their inherent worth, their dignity, then I think we can forge much better, more constructive relationships, and that's going to improve the performance of systems. That thinking also is what drove the Enlightened Enterprise Academy's idea of establishing the Critical Systems Forum, because at the end of the day, if everything that we are trying to do to achieve prosperity boils down to our dependence on systems. And so it's absolutely essential that we understand the effectiveness of systems and why, at the moment, many of them, as highlighted by COVID, are not very effective at all.
Yes, I would agree. And one final question just popped in from Otti, which is this question of how you're thinking about dignity. Is it dignity of the individual, or what about the interdependence between us? Is there something important in that we should also cherish in thinking about this concept?
If I understand the question correctly, I think what is being asked there is, what's the relationship between our own inherent sense of self-worth and our responsibility to others in groups or in society? Well, it's interesting because dignity is a well understood concept within legal systems. It's one of the reasons why it was adopted by the United Nations as a concept. So I think you can look at it, I can respond to that in two ways. One is by saying, I think many legal systems have addressed that issue. But I think there's another way of looking at it, and I think that's the normative way of looking at it too. So the reason the United Nations adopted dignity as the first and foundational human right, to which all of the others are contributing factors, is because they analysed every major religion in the world for what were the common values across all of them. And the concept of dignity exists as a primary value in every major religion in the world. And therefore, I think it makes it even more powerful as a concept for thinking about what do we mean by value as human beings. And it makes the idea of market price theory of value look, in my view, even more ridiculous.
Yes. No, well, thank you very much for that, Paul. We've run up to our coffee time, but I think some of the things that you're talking about there are really important and speak to some of the things being raised in the chat around the incremental tinkering with our businesses is certainly an important area that we need to focus on, but there's a wider question of what kind of society and world are we trying to build that business can speak to and be in service of. And I think what you're outlining there is starting to shape some ideas of what the contours of that might start to look like.